The Right Honorable Arthur Meighen, PC, stands for Prime Minister of Canada. This is a continuation of the books by Robert Graham. Arthur Meighen, a biography by Robert Graham, The Door of Opportunity. Contents. Preface. The years of preparation, from classroom to courtroom, from courtroom to commons, promotion to the ministry, wartime politics, railway problems and national discord, wartime politics, conscription, wartime politics, strategy for a test of strength, the 1917 election and a journey overseas, political uncertainties and social unrest, the nationalization of the Grand Trunk Railway, successor to Borden, appendix, notes, index. Chapter 1. The Years of Preparation. St. Mary's, Canada West. It was not much of a place, an insignificant hamlet tucked away remotely in the midst of the huge forest, huddled in the valley of the north branch of the Thames River, where the river descended 3 dainty steps in its slow meandering course towards Lake St. Clair, a sawmill, a grist mill, a few log houses, and a store furnished small, brave testimony that civilization had declared war on the wilderness. Along the edges of the narrow valley, the hills rose steeply all around the great trees in majestic profusion, witnessed silently to the long, hard labor awaiting those who would conquer the land. Land! That was the great lure in the 5th decade of the 19th century when this story begins. It was the prospect of finding good, cheap land that had attracted the pioneer settlers who were moving in. They were coming now, the hungry, the dispossessed, the disgruntled, the ambitious, and adventurous. And already the forest was beginning to recede before the ringing blows of the axe. It was the lure of land that brought one young Ulsterman in particular to St. Mary's at the end of 1843. Rolled up in a pack, he carried his meager traveling possessions, a couple of blankets, some food and clothing, a few books, and a document signed by the Reverend J. Harvey Rice of Barton, Canada West, attesting that the bearer, Mr. Gordon Meighen, is a member of the Presbyterian Church in this place in good and regular standing, and as such, at his own request, is hereby dismissed and affectionately recommended to the Christian fellowship and watchful care of any sister church, where God in his righteous providence should cast his lot. Gordon Meighen's arrival was, in fact, providential, both for himself and for St. Mary's. He was a school teacher, and the settlement was about to have a school. Gordon, the 7th of the 8 children of Arthur Meighen, a yeoman of Londonderry, had moved to Upper Canada in about 1839 and had taught school at Balderson's Corners near the town of Perth in Lanark County, and later in Perth itself. Before long he felt the urge to move on further west into the Huron tract, a vast wedge of territory, 10,000 square miles in extent, stretching eastward from Lake Huron and the St. Clair River. The tract was the property of the Canada Company, which enthusiastically advertised the advantages of buying land in it. It may have been the property's propaganda that persuaded Gordon Meighen to leave the relatively settled society of Perth and try his luck on a homestead in the Western Peninsula. He arrived at St. Mary's, which was situated near the southeast corner of the Huron tract, which very shortly after the naming of the settlement, an event related to the building of the first school whose teacher Gordon was destined to be, founded in 1842 by Thomas Ingersoll. The place had originally been known as Little Falls. Ingersoll had laid out a town plan and sold several lots, but the titles to these proved to be defective, since the name Little Falls had not, as required, been formally registered with the Canada Company. Thus, somewhat confusing legal difficulties had arisen, which could only be resolved by the choice of an official name. To see that they were resolved, Thomas Mercer Jones, commissioner of the Canada Company, visited Little Falls in 1843, and brought with him his wife, the daughter of no less a personage than Bishop John Strachan of Toronto. A meeting of the inhabitants was called, and the ways of democracy were at once revealed. A minority favored retaining the name Little Falls. A majority wished to change it, but could not decide on a new name. Several names were proposed and rejected, and various orators had their say. Finally, Mary Strachan Jones intervened, perhaps moved by a sense of noblesse oblige, but more probably by a desire to get away from the wretched place, and settled the matter in a sprightly and novel fashion. She suggested that the village be named after her. In consideration of this honor, she would, she announced, contribute £10 toward the cost of the new schoolhouse the settlers desired to build. The obstinacy of those who preferred other names melted away before Mrs. Jones' charm and the equally alluring charm of her money. What was a name after all? But £10. Mr. Jones handed over the money. Little Falls became St. Mary's, and Mary Jones, as befitted the daughter of John Strachan, achieved sainthood and immortalized her name with one impetuous gesture. It was just after this that Gordon Meighen reached St. Mary's. Family tradition has it that he was the builder of the school, which was constructed of limestone quarried locally at a cost of £100. Wow. Though no doubt to some extent its erection was a community enterprise. When it was finished and ready for use, the villagers applied to the Canada Company for its contribution of 10% of the cost of construction, which it was accustomed to pay for all schools built in its territory. The reply, signed by Mr. Commissioner Jones, was somewhat disillusioning. He had already paid the school grant, he wrote, and he reminded the villagers of the christening ceremony. The company's share was £10, and they could not deny that they had received that amount from him as the company's officer. It was a grievous blow to the people, and the worst of it was that the name St. Mary's was already duly registered with the company. Whether or not Gordon Meighen was the school's sole builder, certainly he was its first master. For 3 or 4 years, commencing in the autumn of 1844, he instructed the young scholars of the village and established a considerable reputation, especially as an expert in mathematics. But like most others who found their way to St. Mary's at that time, he had come to acquire land and almost at once applied to the Canada Company for a homestead. The site he had chosen was on the town line of Blanchard Township, 8 or 9 miles northwest of the village, It was a farm of 100 acres, and the patent for it was issued on November the 27th, 1844. As Meighen was still working in St. Mary's, he did not at once move to his farm, but he walked out there whenever possible to fell the trees, clear the ground, and build himself a log cabin. On his hikes back and forth between the village and the homestead, he got into the habit of counting his steps, presumably in order to reduce the number as much as possible by finding the shortest route through the forest. Not long after receiving his patent, he married Isabella Irwin, whose brother owned the farm next door. Like Meighen and many other pioneers of Blanchard Township, the Irwins were Ulster people and Presbyterians, newly arrived from the old country. These good folk, sober, industrious, and God-fearing, along with the Scots with whom they shared the district, left a strong imprint of earnest Puritanism on its life and on the attitudes of its inhabitants, which was not to fade noticeably for generations to come. In 1846, the first of the two Meighen children was born. It was a son whom his parents christened Joseph. About a year later, the teacher resigned from his job in the Stone School of St. Mary's, and the family moved to their own property. Although there must have been enough work to do on the farm to keep any able-bodied and ambitious man occupied, farming for Gordon Meighen proved to be never more than a part-time occupation. The love of teaching was in him. No sooner had he moved from St. Mary's than he was busy building another school about a mile south of his homestead, at a tiny crossroads hamlet known then and still known as Anderson. Having built the Anderson School, he became its master, receiving for his labors the princely stipend of something. I don't know what that is. He L5115.3 D a year to the third, or whatever it is. He continued to teach there and to farm until 1859, when he died prematurely, leaving his wife and two children, the second, Eliza Jane, having been born in 1848. The untimely death of his father meant that Joseph had to leave school at the age of 13 in order to help his mother on the farm. In any event, with no high school nearby, it would not have been easy to continue his schooling. He thus had heavy responsibilities thrust upon him at a tender age, and this experience no doubt reinforced the lessons taught by the Calvinistic theology in which he was reared, and the frontier environment in which he grew up. The lessons of individual moral responsibility, self-reliance, sobriety, industry, and thrift. The Presbyterian Church taught that these qualities were the marks of righteousness. The hard life of the frontier proved them to be advantageous, even necessary to existence. When he was in his early 20s, Joseph Meighen fell in love with Mary Jane Bell, the daughter of Henry Bell, who had a farm about 3/4 of a mile to the east. The Bells also hailed from Ulster, from the vicinity of Cookstown near Belfast. Early in 1871, the young couple were married, and Joseph took his bride to the homely but substantial stone house his father had built to replace the original log cabin. The house, unlike its neighbors, stood as it stands now at the far end of the farm from the concession road. Some say Gordon Meighen built so far from the road because that was the only place on his property where there was a good well. Others say that he was misinformed as to the location of the town line road, which had not yet been laid out. At any rate, there stood the house in a pleasant rolling landscape, surrounded by fertile soil no longer filled with the roots of great fallen trees, but cleared, cultivated, and productive. Here on June the 16th, 1874, Arthur Meighen came into the world, the second of the 6 children born to Joseph and Mary Meighen during the first 12 years of their long life together. There were 3 girls and 3 boys, each of whom with commendable frugality was given only one Christian name: Annie, Arthur, Sarah, William, Edward, and Jenny. Not one of 6, Arthur later recalled, ever failed to testify to the wholesome home teaching that emphasized continuously the immeasurable value of sound education and the equally limitless and permanent importance of habits of industry and thrift. We were surely made to know that our success or failure depended solely on ourselves, and the idea that we could attribute to others, or to the community, or to the country, accountability for our own failure was never permitted to find lodgment in our minds. To these principles we owe whatever success life has brought us. All those who knew Arthur as a child seemed to form impressions of him remarkable for their unanimity. They remembered him as the most distinctive of the Meighen children, a somewhat withdrawn, quiet, and very clever youngster of frail appearance, studious, serious, contemplative, and absent-minded, a boy who gave the impression of living mentally in a world somewhat removed from his immediate surroundings. He commenced his education in the school his grandfather had built and presided over at Anderson. Every morning he set out for Anderson, lunchbox and schoolbooks in hand, following the bank of a small stream known as Flat Creek, which pursued its insignificant easterly course across the farms of the neighbors to the south until it joined the Thames a few miles away. Along the creek he would go until he came to the Anderson Road, about a quarter of a mile from home, and then turn down the road to school. Although he was an exemplary pupil, capable and industrious, Arthur annoyed his teacher in one respect. He was frequently late in reaching his desk. His father explained that this was because he stopped to count the fish in Flat Creek. The stream and its denizens seemed to fascinate him. Once he set his lunchbox on the ground beside him as he stopped to gaze contemplatively into the water. When the noon hour came and the scholars reached expectantly for their provender, Arthur's, alas, was not to be found. Provender, I guess. He had left it beside the creek. In time, a reputation for aloofness came to surround this unusual and rather solitary little boy. Indeed, a modern psychologist might have found in him some of the disturbing characteristics of the isolate, standing apart as he did from the communal activities of his fellows and resisting the socializing pressures of the group. But his contemporaries at school, both at Anderson and at the other school on the town line, which he attended subsequently when the school districts were changed, recalled much later, after he had become a national figure, that he had had enough of the average boy in him to avoid becoming the most contemptible of beings, the teacher's pet. One of them even remembered that the teacher had given Arthur a licking for gouging out the center of a piece of chalk and using it to imprint circular marks on the backs of the other pupils. For all that, the eldest Meighen boy stood out sharply from the crowd. He was not unfriendly, but he did not go out of his way to make friends. He seemed unmistakably to prefer his own company. The other children always called him Arthur, never Art, or even Meighen. Only the members of his immediate family ever called him Art, and he apparently tried to discourage this. One day, when his youngest sister, Jenny, was about 2, she was playing around the barn with William and Edward. Arthur, who was then 10 or 11, appeared, and Jenny greeted him as Hart. He remonstrated with her gravely and patiently explained, No, the heart is something in here," pointing to his chest. "My name is Arthur." Certainly the boy was less gregarious than most children of his age. He had no love for sports and was not proficient in them. The good-natured wrestling indulged in by the other boys as a release of animal spirits struck him as pointless and a waste of time. When school was out for the day, the others, including his own brothers and sisters, would tarry, unless the weather was very cold, to play a game of some sort or chaff each other. But Arthur Meighen would set his face towards home, up the road, along the creek, over the rail fence, and in the back door. There might be a chore for a small boy to do around the farm, or lessons to prepare for the next day. But if he were especially lucky, there would be time for supper to spend with whatever book he was currently reading. Once he had learned to read, it became his chief recreation. Indeed, more than that, his ruling passion. Efforts were made to interest him in more athletic pastimes, for the benefits of healthful outdoor exercise were recognized. His father made him a bow and some arrows and tried to teach him how to use them, but Arthur was neither interested in nor adept at archery. From his father's workshop, too, came a cleverly fashioned spear with which to annoy the fish in Flat Creek, but by his indifference the boy showed that he would rather count than kill them. Of course, exercise could be had by doing useful work on the farm. This was the best means yet discovered of strengthening moral as well as physical fiber, and in any case, the remorseless routine of labor required the help of all hands, however small and inexperienced. The jobs assigned him Arthur did with a will. His first considerable task was to weed by hand a field of mangels. He was promised and received 3 cents a row for the work, but the rows were 200 feet or more in length. "I stuck to the job until finished," he wrote long afterward, and in some measure established a reputation in the household for persistence. He had less success with his one and only attempt to milk a cow. Bravely, he sat on the milking stool and went to work. When nothing happened, despite his earnest endeavor, his mother, who was watching, exclaimed, "For pity's sake, Arthur, go do something you can do." What could Arthur do? Well, besides weeding mangels, his 2 brothers, once they were old enough, seemed to take naturally to farm work. But Arthur was more at home reading, studying, and talking about what he had read and studied. Even as a youngster, he showed remarkable powers of concentration. When he was immersed in a book, he became utterly oblivious to the bustling activity of the rest of the family. Fortunately, his parents were glad to encourage him in these habits. Neither of my parents, he later recalled, ever begrudged me the time which I occupied in good reading, though some of it might have been on work days. Any thought of taking time that could be employed in farm work for any other form of recreation would have been instantly smothered in disapproval. Neither Joseph nor Mary Meighen had much schooling, but both had a very high regard for books and learning. They were determined that, so long as they showed they deserved them, their children should have all the advantages of education which circumstances had denied to them. It was largely this consideration that led Joseph to sell the old place on the Blanchard town line in the spring of 1886 and move to another farm on the western edge of St. Mary's, within walking distance of the town's high school. If they had remained out in the township 8 or 9 miles away, the education of the children would have ended when they finished public school, since their parents could not afford to board them in St. Mary's for the winter. But it was simply unthinkable to the Meighens that their children's schooling should stop then, so the only thing to do was to move. While recognizing the importance of formal education, the parents knew that its benefits would be largely nullified by the lack of a proper atmosphere at home. The children were constantly admonished to pay attention to the teacher, to prepare their lessons thoroughly, and to remember the great truth that to live a successful and worthy life one requires knowledge. But learning, after all, did not begin and end in school. Knowledge was to be found, too, and perhaps most of all, in the great world of books. In their reading, The children were guided and inspired chiefly by their mother, a woman of high intelligence and strong character, with a literary turn of mind. Their father's reading was confined mainly to the farm journals, which he perused assiduously in order to make himself as proficient as possible in his work, and to keep abreast of important developments in agriculture. He was a skillful and progressive dirt farmer, but he made no pretense of being anything more. He was acutely conscious of his inability to speak and write grammatically, and, while he had his own father's talent with numbers, he readily conceded that he was not his wife's equal when it came to a knowledge of literature and history. Mary Meighen's favorite author was Thomas Carlyle. She knew all about Oliver Cromwell and Frederick the Great and the French Revolution, but her tastes were Catholic enough to embrace the works of most of the great English poets and prose writers. Their books she begged, borrowed, or bought, urging her children to use and enjoy them. Arthur, for one, needed no urging, and many a pleasant afternoon he spent undisturbed under a fruit tree, or, if the weather was inclement, curled up indoors near the stove, and in the company of Shakespeare, Gibbon, Wordsworth, Byron, Macaulay, Carlyle, or Scott. His youngest brother, Edward, retained to the end of his days a memory of Arthur as a youth lying on the floor, totally absorbed in the book before him and absent-mindedly eating grapes from a nearby bowl. Blessed with an unusually retentive memory, he remembered what he read, and was fascinated by the various ways in which his favorite authors used the English language. Of them all, Shakespeare, he knew, was incontestably the greatest, though for a lively and lucid prose style he thought Macaulay had no peer. But all were companions who never failed to delight, no matter how many times he reread their magic pages. Since Sunday was a day when no work was done except the inescapable chores, it provided the greatest opportunities for reading. It was also, however, the day for formal religious instruction, and while the family lived out in Blanchard, every Sabbath morning found them in the wagon bound for the Presbyterian Church at Motherwell, about 3 miles to the north in Fullerton Township. Every Sunday afternoon, the children who were old enough walked back to the church again to hear the familiar Bible stories and the equally familiar moral lessons drawn from them. Unfortunately, Anderson, which was closer, had only a Methodist church, which the Meighen's were not inclined to attend. At Motherwell, the true word was expounded, and after all, apostasy was much more to be dreaded than inconvenience. Once, though, how or why he could not later remember, Arthur did find himself in attendance at a service in the Anderson church. The proceedings differed markedly from those he was accustomed to, and had, in his young Presbyterian eyes, a deplorable lack of decorum and restraint. At Motherwell, emotions were kept in check. One remained sober, silent, and still during the sermon, no matter how long it lasted. But at Anderson, the pastor's fervent remarks were punctuated frequently by cries of Amen. Even the children joined their elders in what seemed to Arthur a shockingly rude display of impatience. In his own church, one might think that the preacher had gone on long enough, but one would never dare to signify this opinion with shouts of Amen. The Motherwell church was situated on the edge of the Mitchell Road, which ran in a northwesterly direction from a point west of St. Mary's toward the village of Mitchell. At church and Sunday school, the stern teachings of home and school, the virtue of hard work, the necessity of moral rectitude, and the responsibility of the individual, the wrath of God towards those who disobeyed his laws, were fortified by religious authority. In those good, simple days, the separate influences of home, school, and church were in happy harmony, and pointed the individual in the direction of the same goal. success on earth and salvation in heaven through his own worth and effort. As luck would have it, the weekly journeys to and from Motherwell provided an objective illustration of the great truth that the Lord did not help those who did not help themselves. At the corner of the town line and the Mitchell Road lived an indigent farmer by the name of Johnny Cameron, a Scot distinguished from his neighbors, and most of his nationality by a laziness of character and a thriftiness of habit which were the despair of his family and a warning to his disapproving friends. As the Meighen came down the road on Sundays, they beheld the Cameron farm neglected, and the Cameron house in disrepair, and the 4 hungry, ragged Cameron children balefully watching their progress from the overgrown yard, while the other farmers in the district took care of the morrow, tilling fields, tending stock, and repairing implements. Johnny Cameron improved the hours by tinkering with the perpetual motion machine he had invented, a device which would any day now bring him fame and great fortune. In the meantime, his property went to rack and ruin, and his family suffered the consequences of his cleverness. Here was poverty with all its horrid squalor to be observed and pondered, poverty of which the sole cause was sheer indolence. No one could have been more disgusted by Cameron than Joseph Meighen, who was always fastidiously insistent on keeping up with the work on his own farm. The name of the worthless man became a byword in the Meighen household, and Mary Meighen, admonishing her children, would frequently warn them that, if they failed in honest diligence, they too might become like him. The example of Johnny Cameron proved indeed the truth of the lessons that were constantly dinned into the young Meighens. Life on the farm was a constant struggle against the difficulties imposed by nature, which, though the soil was good, were still considerable. To get ahead in this world, as any self-respecting person must desire to do, one must make a single-minded, purposeful, onward march toward whatever worthy goal one had in view. One was always confronted with opportunities which must be seized, and with temptations which must be shunned. One must know that time wasted was time lost, that a penny saved was a penny earned. Whatever one undertook to do should be done with all one's might, and persisted in until it was accomplished. These were the rules of the road to success and of the good life. When he was 10 or 11, Arthur set out on his first business venture. The door of opportunity opened, and he entered, as he was to do invariably throughout his life. The publishers of the Farmer's Advocate offered the prize of the pocket watch to those who secured a certain number of new subscribers. A watch! That was something worth working for. Armed with subscription forms, a pencil, and a very earnest manner, Arthur scoured the district